Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
So, welcome. Great background. So Nick is the head of Innovation Society at the World Economic Forum. He's effectively in charge of thinking about how the fourth industrial revolution impacts society, from trade unions, church leaders, members of civil society like ourselves. And he's going to be giving us a run through of what it actually is in terms of real detail, and also then how we can react. And later on after his speech, you'll have some time for Q&A, and then we'll break out into groups to think about what it means for us as individuals and as a community. So Nick, over to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Matt and Lee. Just to through my speech, Lee, can you mute from your side?
Yeah.
Great. So now you'll have to use hand signals to communicate to me through the screen, but that'll be fine. So listen, first of all, thanks very much for having me. I would have loved to be with you in person, but I'm frantically with the team writing a follow-up book on the fourth industrial revolution, which is a more practical description of what this topic is and how we as a global community can take these issues forward in a very socially driven, values-driven way. And it's a great opportunity to then mention some of those ideas and get your feedback and see how then your passion and activities and that of the fourth group might tie in and support some of the things that the forum is sketching out and framing today. So I just want to start by saying, or asking the question rather, what do we mean when we say industrial revolution? And I think there's two really important things to keep in mind here. First of all, the word industrial is around value creation. It's around economic activity. So when we talk about an industrial revolution, we're talking about a revolution in the way that we create, distribute, or exchange value in society. And the second point I want to say is that it's a revolution of economic activity, of industrial activity in its grandest sense. But that doesn't mean that it's not a revolution that affects all other parts of society. And indeed, if you think back to the first industrial revolution, that was an industrial revolution that changed manufacturing, but it changed literally the way that people perceived time. It created a whole new class of workers whose lives were dictated by a steam whistle on the outside of a factory, whole communities that changed the entirely where they lived, their gender roles, their relationship to power, their relationship to one another in the course of about 100 years, a massive change across Europe. And of course, that spread around the world. So it's an industrial revolution. It's about value transformation, but it's also about social and political revolution as well. The second thing I wanted to touch on is, why do we say the fourth industrial revolution, and how do we characterize these and number them? And I just want to mention that this is a complete fiction. There is no truth here. We are creating convenient categories to make it easier and more useful to talk about the future and come together in collective action or decision-making in some way. But we can broadly regard the first industrial revolution as that original period between 1750 and 1850, where the mechanical loom, the spinning jenny, those types of the introduction of fossil fuels, the first period of mechanization that led to the steam engine and trains revolutionized transport, manufacturing, production, and many other sources of power. The second industrial revolution, less well known than the first, but it really took place around the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And if you look around the room in which you're sitting today, pretty much everything you see is a product of the second industrial revolution, from the chairs you're sitting on to the clothes that you wear, to the glasses that might be on your face. These things are a product of the mass manufacturing, a revolution in electricity systems, in telecommunication systems, so on and so forth. And the third industrial revolution is really, what some of you might be looking at or thinking about in terms of the virtual world. The digital revolution really picked up with the advent of information theory in the 1950s, and is still going on today. And that brings me to a small sidebar on this concept of industrial revolutions, because although I'm putting dates around different concepts, the greatest social injustice of industrial revolutions, and one of the interesting aspects of them, is that they are not well distributed around the world. So today we have 4 billion people who don't have access to the internet. They haven't experienced the third industrial revolution. There are 2.4 billion people who don't have access to clean water and sanitation. That was an absolute hallmark of the second industrial revolution, as was access to electricity. About 1.2 billion people don't have that today. There are still 600 million smallholder farmers that don't use fertilizers or mechanical power or other sources of energy to plow their fields. They still haven't benefited from the first industrial revolution. So while we talk about these things, we need to keep a sense of distribution of these ideas, of these systems, a sense of who bears the cost of the externalities in these systems, and the social justice that is the heart of some of the values that bring many of us together on these points. The revolution we see of as post-digital. So this is really important. Digital and fourth industrial revolution we see as two separate things. And here I'll just define the boundary for you. As I said, it's not truth, it's just a useful idea. And that is that the digital revolution could not have happened without reliable energy systems, electricity, and telecommunication. The digital systems were able to sit on top of that flow of energy, of electrons and radio and other types of signals through the air. In the same way, the systems of the fourth industrial revolution rely entirely on digital as a baseline infrastructure. So they rely on processing power, communication, encryption, digitization, memory, storage, so on and so forth. So that's, when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, we first of all realize that many of us are still going through the third industrial and digital revolution. And second, well, I'd say that the fourth industrial revolution is really still only just emerging, because as Alvin said earlier, it's things like neurotechnologies, which are very interesting in the lab right now, but haven't yet quite made it out there. It is applications of the Internet of Things, which are starting to be used, but are not by any means ubiquitous. Although you may have seen the recent DNS attacks using a botnet of security cameras, which is incredibly concerning for people interested in this area. We're talking about new forms of cryptography, new forms of artificial intelligence, those kind of things, biotechnologies and material sciences. So that's where we are. To move to a kind of, well, so what? That sounds interesting. Should we just be geeking out on the technologies and taking them one by one? One of the questions we keep getting asked at the World Economic Forum is, what's different about the fourth industrial revolution from the digital revolution? Why should we be thinking and talking about this as a different world to play in? And why should a group like the London Global Shapers or Alvin start to look at this as an important aspect for society, for politics, as well as industrial companies who are thinking of using this technology? And the answer is that there are some pretty big tensions and issues coming out of the fourth industrial revolution, which are partly driven by that digital base, which is kind of at the heart of everything that's being built on top of it. So one of them you will have heard many times is the idea of convergence. Traditional boundaries between sectors are blurring, in many cases breaking down. Thanks to platforms, thanks to a free flow of ideas, there are lots of innovations at the periphery of different areas and at the intersection of different areas. And that's really important because it means that we no longer sit in single language disciplines as we had basically that were set up during the first and second industrial revolution. The second thing is a concept of re-emergence or embodiment or embeddedness. Physical objects are emerging from the virtual, and we are embedding virtual objects in ourselves in different ways. So the line between what is human and what is digital, between what is physical and its virtual representation, is very different to what it was 10, 15 years ago. And this is not just a case of an isolated example of me being able to print, an image of someone using a 3D printer. So I get a digitized version of someone, and then I can create a physical artifact of that back into reality. When you think about it, that's important as a whole system of being able to put things into a digital realm and take things out again. And some of the really interesting aspects of this are the digitization of the human genome and what it enables us to then do in terms of the physical production of new therapies that can change, for, at the moment, really revolutionizing cancer and oncology. 2 more points on this before I move on the forum's take on this. The third dynamic that I think is really interesting is that there is a whole new set of hierarchies and structures of inequality that can come out of the 4th industrial revolution that many of us are worried about. In the 3rd industrial revolution, in the digital revolution, everyone said this was about the democratization of information. This was about the ability for everyone to be skilled and engaged and connected in ways that weren't allowed, weren't as empowering as in previous systems, mostly because of the ubiquitous reach of the network and the low cost of that. However, we're very much seeing right now that access to those networks creates power centers, creates the ability to influence. Facebook estimates that in 2016 alone, their efforts in prompting people to register for voting online have resulted in 1 million new voter registrations across the US. And in the elections last year in Britain, when Facebook started its voting campaign for British users, it doubled the amount of registrations overnight on the Cabinet Office's campaign because it linked to that. So if that's the power of the 3rd industrial revolution, which is the information revolution, controlling the centers of power in the 4th industrial revolution is even more interesting and more concerning. And the 4th dynamic that I think is interesting goes to this issue of how things scale and grow. And you may have heard people talking about, oh, it's the 4th industrial revolution is exponentially driven. It's all about growth at rates that we can't cope with as a society. I think the truth, or some of the sense at the heart of that concern, is that some aspects like processing power, like the ability to reach new users, is indeed exponential. So every additional resource you add to your system, you get more than one resource out at the other side. And that is not true of government. So government, large institutions work the other way. You add one more person, you get less than 1 unit of additional resource back out of that system, because you're adding complexity of human beings relating to one another. It's what we complain about when we talk about bureaucracy. In software development, it's the issue of actually doubling your time to market when you add more developers rather than lessening it because you add complexity in the system. So this idea of scaling tension it was already kind of evident in the digital world, but when everything is digital, you don't get the same set of contrasting constraints. And so a big issue for the 4th group and for you to think about is, where in my life am I seeing exponential growth of capability or value in one part of my life, but at the same time it's being held back because other systems are not able to cope or interface with that at the same rate of change. And that's where I think Alvin's point about and kind of a polytech and new tools and a new political philosophy is needed to think about how we can move forward. The forum's unique take on the 4th industrial revolution is that this is not a conversation about technology foresight. It's not about trying to understand what the next big thing is in artificial intelligence. Instead, it's very normative. It's got a very direct values-driven goal at the end of it. And I'll break that into 4 quick parts. The first one is to say, this is about looking at systems as a whole and not at individual technologies. So we want to understand not what that new form of encryption does in this particular instance, a new version of the blockchain. We want to know how that transforms finance or land registration or tracking of trees in a forest or diamonds in the Kimberley process. The second thing is, we really want this to be an empowering discussion and an empowering revolution. So we want people to feel like they have choice over technologies and how they affect their lives. The third principle is we want people to feel that sense of power is translated into an ability to design a world that we want, and to apply design principles in things like government, in organizational design, in other systems, and to really be able to exchange ideas about what designs work and what doesn't in this field. And the fourth principle that we bring to this is to say the idea of positive values and principles should be a feature of systems and not a bug of these systems. And that's a bit, software speak, but what I mean is we shouldn't throw stuff out there and say, oh, whoops, this is hurting Shia Muslim in southern Iraq who are now being, identified and located by militia thanks to this new app that we didn't think could be hacked in this way. We shouldn't be going down the route of the excuse that Google's giving at the moment, with all due respect to Google, which is to say our algorithms are simply representing what the underlying data is telling us in terms of searches for criminal justice services for people with African American names. So therefore, it's really not us that can be blamed when people search for African American names. They get searches which are incredibly biased towards background checks and criminal justice services, so on and so forth. We need to actually think about what values we want embedded in these systems first and design to that, rather than just trying to create the fixes on the other end. So our concept of leadership in the fourth industrial revolution, and I promise I'm already almost done here, is to think beyond technology leadership into three other areas of leadership. So technology leadership is the idea, well, how do we actually create new technologies, new exciting capabilities, and make them come to life that will help us or not? The second idea is, well, hold on a second, can we be values leaders? Can we, in developing the technologies and thinking about how we use them, can we actually shape a goal of what is good in those systems, as well as principles for what is right, to use kind of the language of ethics in those systems. The third goal, which is what I think many of us here today are really interested in, is leadership around governance, which goes beyond government, but leadership on how we create and distribute and adhere to rules in a world that's really changing thanks to technology. And finally, we think about systems leadership. So trying to go across all those things at the same time, which is really the forum's pipe dream in a way. So we've actually set up a new center for the fourth industrial revolution in San Francisco, which we launched last month and which will officially open in February. And so the World Economic Forum is really investing heavily in the responses that Alvin lined up at the beginning of this. And for us, they're very similar to what Alvin said. We want a new narrative around technology and society. We want multi-stakeholder perspectives from all of you and from our other shapers, hubs and groups and communities around the world. We want those to happen across traditional boundaries. We want new tools like the Polytech that Alvin mentioned, new ways of navigating and shaping the world and these systems. And speaking as a lawyer, I'm really interested in new legal and political infrastructure that can actually help us navigate the world towards in the direction that we want to go. So I'll just finish by saying I think it's amazing that you're here. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen to me. I'm sorry I can't be with you guys in person. And thanks to Alvin, Matt and Lee and the others at the London Shapers Hub for running with this. We're very keen for any and all perspectives on this, including Nick, you're not making any sense, or we couldn't hear you, and for the last 15 minutes you've just been speaking to a blank screen. But any and all of that is welcome. So thanks, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. I'm still muted.
Thanks, Nick, for that.
Yep, I got you.
Okay, for the tour of force around what the actual fourth industrial revolution is and some of the challenges politically, socially, and technologically, I guess. And we'd be good to put it to the floor straight away. I know you've got 10 to 15 minutes or so to answer questions. So we'll take them in batches of 3. So if you have a question, please put your hand up and you can make a statement, but not for too long. Yeah. Please.
So, Facebook and LinkedIn and Microsoft and Co. recently launched an ethics organization to deal with some of the technological issues that are coming through in the ethics and the ethics relating to them. It has some incomprehensible name related to it. I was wondering how the fourth group and the World Economic Forum will interact with that community and any other tech ethics communities out there.
Cheers. Second question.
We live in a world driven by information and technology. What about potential hackers that can manipulate data in order for everyone to think from?
So ethics, hacking. Can take one more.
It's great to hear you mention about negative and externalities, and probably our next event will focus on what technology, politics and climate change will look like in that intersection, and just would love to hear more about your thoughts around negative and externalities and getting global actors and global citizenship to engage and hopefully respond to the fourth industrial revolution.
Great. Shall I take those three, Arvin?
Yes, please.
So on the other people doing cool things in this space, absolutely, the forum is trying to act like a platform here rather than a coordinator or central source of truth. So one of the recent, interesting kind of initiatives in this area is the partnership on artificial intelligence, which Facebook and Microsoft and Amazon, DeepMind and others put together. And that's a group that we're talking about working with and opening up our platform in San Francisco, particularly on these topics. So if you have recommendations for other cool areas working on this, absolutely, please, we'd love to join with them. We have actually an expert group of 25 people from around the world on a council that's called Technology, Values and Policy, who represent lots of different efforts across bioethics, automated warfare, neuroscience, and some social scientists and philosophers as well. So we're trying to kind of, as I said, be a place that we can convene and support these efforts, and rather than coordinate, simply kind of lift them up and synthesize where necessary to amplify the message. So that's great. I think one of the biggest issues on this is a lot of people don't think that ethics is very practical. And so many of the companies that we talk to, particularly the entrepreneurs, tech entrepreneurs, say, look, ethics is all great. We've got a value statement on the wall, but I need to ship a product. I don't know how to transfer that into my business model, apart from the fact that I know that I don't want to be evil, etc. So I think there's a way to do, whereas we have many discussions about ethics and compliance in the lab for scientists, and in Europe we have responsible research and innovation, I think the ethics discussion designed for values, etc., is something that's not as common in accelerators and incubators, at least the ones that, and Fab Labs, etc., at least the ones that I've been in contact with. And maybe, Matt, that's something that you could speak to, or others, around the link between entrepreneurship and practical ethics is something that I'm quite keen on going deeper in. We have Jeff Morgan from Nesta leading some work on that with us at the moment. On the second question around hackers, I think this is a really key concern, because as you can imagine, if you've got an infrastructure which is purely digital, and then you have the ability for anyone to attack that from anywhere, you have a very insecure, unsafe, and untrustworthy fourth industrial revolution. Is that people are designing out that type of vulnerability, and one of them is this idea of performance, processing, and storage at the edge of systems. So when you have, for instance, Sensity Systems, which is a company just bought by Verizon, it produces basically intelligent lights, public street lights, and each street light has in it a set of cameras and sensors that work to, detect things like traffic levels, obviously weather conditions. But what they can do is they can detect if someone is leaving a bag, an unidentified bag, on its own in a busy space. Designed a little bit in response to the Boston bombings. There was a lot of inspiration in terms of what Boston lacked in terms of public safety systems. Now, you can imagine, if you are passionate about civil rights, you probably don't want every time you walk anywhere in Boston to not just be recorded by a computer, by the street lamps you're walking under, but that information to be funneled to the basement of a police station where there's a giant server that's vulnerable to someone who can either socially engineer their way in there or brute force hack and break that open. That would be awful if that data escaped. And you can imagine in these systems, it's a lot of the data that people picking their noses and just pure privacy stuff you just don't want in these kind of systems. So how do you design that out? Well, Sensity's got one solution, which is none of the data actually leaves the light post. It runs machine learning algorithms for vision, for machine vision, on the light post, on the chip. It stores the information there, and the only thing it can do is it can send a note to the authorities saying, "Hi, at this point in time, someone left a large bag next to this rubbish bin. I don't know whether it's suspicious. Do you want to see a 30-second clip where the faces are all blurred for that period?" And it automatically blurs the faces. It automatically does all the encryption, and it just sends that small portion for someone to say, "No, that's fine," or "Hold on, we need to look at that in more detail." And the really intelligent, I think about Sensity is that they've built it into a legal infrastructure where you can't unblur the faces or take more than that clip that the system notifies you of without a court order, without a warrant. So it actually builds it into a sense of trust and of justice systems, as well as the technological systems as well. So I think that's an example of trying to at least think of systems architecture at the edge for something that otherwise, CCTV in London is pretty ubiquitous, but I guess, we're in, all of us might be in two minds about that. So trying to build these things into the systems are really important. But as the denial of service attack that happened across the US a couple of days ago, that this is really a problematic issue for the world. And finally, the final question around climate and the environment. There's a couple of things here. There's huge opportunity for more coalition building to come in around the issue of climate and the environment. There's a troubling trend in the fourth industrial revolution where the more that people get excited about technology, they think that technology is the solution rather than behavior. And that's something that we actually continually need to fight against. The number of excited people who think that geoengineering, seeding the air with something is a really good first move rather than a kind of a move of last resort, is a little bit of a concern. And I apologize to those of you in the room who might be geoengineers. But the interesting thing about this is it's really the combination of behavior and awareness and technology that tends to get us where we need to be. So two trends that I'll mention. One is that when we moved away from innovating physical goods and now we innovate in software, we're very much faster increasing the efficiency of lots of different pieces of technology that we use in daily life. And one of these happens to be small, increasingly lightweight batteries that can drive a car around 30, 40 kilometers. And behavioral kind of tracking has shown that most of us with a car, about 80% of our journeys are only under about 22 miles, 25 miles. With a small motor, electrically driven, that could immediately cut huge amounts of emissions from our liquid fuels system around the world. But that requires awareness, behavior, willingness to engage, and that feedback mechanism. So I guess what I'm saying is we can't rely on the technology, but we can hope that it's the enabler that gets us to where we want to be. China starting to now phase out coal plants is actually a huge deal in this. Because they're seeing that they've really come to the party. And our relationship with the Chinese government on the circular economy shows that they are the most passionate and demanding partner that we have on moving as fast as possible on trying to fix the issues that they see in their supply chains. So there's hope in all that area.
Okay, so yeah.
I've just got a question on the idea of global citizenship. So with obviously we're seeing more free movement of data and information, and also of capital, for example. But we're seeing obviously in Europe and, for example, between America and Mexico, kind of more putting up of borders and kind of closing off of more kind of free movement. And I think that one of the biggest injustices in the world is that where you're born so much defines the impact you can generally make and where you end up. So just wondering kind of your thoughts on how the fourth industrial revolution might change, which way you think it might converge, if it's going to go to more closed off or actually we move to more true global citizenship?
Thanks so much. Really good question. Simeon?
How labor intensive do you imagine the fourth revolution will be? And if it's not very labor intensive, that makes inequality a more pressing issue. Where do you begin to combat that?
Yes.
If you're talking about an inclusive new politics, it ties in with the global citizenship question. Talking about an all-inclusive political system and development as a result of this revolution, how are you getting the other voices involved in that conversation now and going forward? Not just, because this is the London metropolitan elite, but also outside of the European US dynamic.
Great question, and something that the fourth would really want to final one, I think I saw one more question. I'll start with.
I have a question on this social trust. With all these new platforms, they definitely try to redefine in many ways how we trust each other, and a lot of new emerging technologies, for example, blockchain, definitely challenges institutional trust. So I have a question: how does fourth industrial revolution can impact the trust? Is it going to increase it, create this new distributed trust, or just increase distrust in society? Because this is something very important for politics.
Thanks, guys. Nick, it would be great to hear your final comments related to those issues and any last things you'd like to share with us.
Sure, and thanks for all the really easy questions to answer. So, global citizenship, I completely agree. The point of where you're born defines so much, and I think that's true on multiple levels, both country and where you are born inside that society. Look, all of these questions have a kind of similar answer, which is we don't really have much data about this from the future, and we're not sure how much the patterns from the past apply, particularly when we talk about the power of the fourth industrial revolution and how that's distributed. Well, I guess the way I would answer this is I would really hope that we can together figure out how to distribute not just access to the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, but the benefits that they distribute in terms of wealth and opportunity in other ways as well, such that we can continue the path of convergence that we've seen on an economic level between countries, but combat the stalling of convergence that we've seen between income levels and between the educated and the non-educated around the world. There's a really interesting book on this which relates to the gender challenge within technology. I'll remember the name of the book in a minute, but it points out that over the last 100 years, thanks to a combination of technology and education, around the world, there's become a bifurcation with gender, particularly among women, where educated, independent women who are able to, they end up far more able to make decisions that essentially are no different from educated, fairly wealthy, powerful men in the world. But the reason why the average is drawn so far down is because they've left a group of women who are essentially very similar situations as their sisters were 150, or their grandparents were 150, 200 years ago, before the industrial revolutions, where power only comes from your social status or relationships in who you marry. And I think that if we are going to understand how to prevent these bifurcations happening in this area, like when we've got with gender, and by the way, the gender impact of the fourth industrial revolution is huge, because we see in India now it's young professional women who are losing the jobs in the call centers as the call center jobs get replaced by artificial intelligence, and the path to professionalism for many women is being taken away in ways that that we thought affected mostly men in previous industrial revolutions. But if we're going to think about this sense of kind of leveling the playing field, I think we really need to think much more beyond, is this service of 3D printing, or is this particular biotechnology available or at a cost point to people who are in marginalized communities? Because that thinking, I think, particularly when it's related to internet services, hasn't actually made a huge difference. This is a really tough question that relates to the point around labor intensity and more inclusive political systems. But I will say that this should be probably one of the #1 questions for the fourth group, to think about the structures of inequality that already exist, that might arise because of power and power distribution in the fourth industrial revolution, and how to overcome boundaries, whether they're social boundaries or national boundaries, is a really big one. I know that's a really unsatisfying answer, it is for me too, but let's keep talking about that, and hopefully I'll have a better one for you after we've discussed more another time. On the second question regarding how labor intensive is the fourth industrial revolution, it may be a little bit more labor intensive than the more recent parts of the third industrial revolution, because it's actually making and producing stuff and distributing stuff in ways that is not purely digital. So if you think about it, Facebook doesn't have that many employees, say around 50,000 employees, for the amount of users it has on its systems and the amount of kind of wealth it generates. But if you look within the Facebook family, Instagram, which Facebook bought, is 10 times more efficient in terms of its ability to generate users and value per employee than Facebook employees are overall. And then if you look at a more recent acquisition, which is WhatsApp, that's 10 times more efficient than Instagram. So you've got 100 times more efficient within there. In the UK, Netflix serves something ridiculous like 22 million users or something across the UK, which is just an incredible number of people signing up to these products. It has 13 employees in the UK, 13. And now I know a lot of that is served from the US, right? But that just goes to show you, when you're dealing with just bits and images on a screen, you have this massive issue of this gap between value creation and labor creation. Now, as I said, I don't think that 100-fold pattern will necessarily hold in the fourth industrial revolution, because it is a lot more service-driven. It's a lot more embedded and back to human beings. It's certainly a lot more manufacturing. But even if it's a fraction of that, we have a big problem in labor inequality. We also have a problem with what type of labor. So I mentioned the gender problem earlier. The gender problem is exacerbated by the fact that those who are graduating from the in-demand technical skills tend to be male. That's an issue in STEM education all around the world, even though university graduates are more than 50% women overall. I think the one exception, by the way, I think is Southeast Asia, which is producing more female engineers than male engineers at the moment. And I think that's fantastic, but the rest of the world, we're still lagging behind on those issues. When we think about making sure that we manage this inequality, I think, again, it comes down to that first point about how do we have discussions around opportunity distribution and not just user distribution here. The third question, more inclusive political systems, I'd love to keep talking about that. I'm not a political scientist, unfortunately, so this area, for me, it's more about the legal governance and the legal content that I tend to focus on, rather than the political engagement. But I certainly think that more and more people are politically engaged, at least in the form of ranting on online media platforms, than they used to be. So I think that perhaps there might be a window of opportunity here to pull more and more people into kind of on the ground activism in different ways, rather than merely kind of armchair collectivism. And the final point on trust, there's three kind of pathways here that you alluded to, which I think are really important. The first one is technical solutions to the trust dynamic between people, and that's you can talk about the blockchain, you can talk about trust architecture, like I just mentioned, which is somehow tying yourself to the mast, like Odysseus, with the sirens, to try and prevent data from flowing in ways that can be untrustworthy. That's one angle. The second pathway is a pathway of social feedback. So someone said to me the other day, you know, when I was a kid, I was told never to get in a car with strangers, and now I pay to get into a car with strangers by using Uber. What's the difference? What's the change in that trust system? Where am I getting my trust from? And it's not really so much trust in Uber, the company. It's trust in the fact that, you know, if something goes wrong, I've got this driver's name and license details, and I can actually send it to someone in a different way. So whether that social feedback is some form of transparency or a rating system in other areas, I think that's a good pathway to trust. And the third one, and this goes back to Alvin and the fourth group, is it's really trust and legitimacy. It's who do we trust to make decisions about technology and society? Do we place trust in our politicians and our political institutions to actually make laws that can possibly keep up and result in the outcomes that we want from technology? Because I can guarantee you now, the large tech companies buy, you know, this is a sweeping statement and I'm being recorded, but it's in the incentives of large technology companies and producers to say, no, the political institutions we currently have can't possibly keep up with what we know and what we do. And they're right in many ways, but that doesn't mean that we need to outsource trust and legitimacy and authority and decision-making only to those with a commercial attitude, a commercial mindset. So how we square that circle, how we have a public conversation about the goals of technology and not just what we value, but how it gets rolled out, is something that we can only do now. With neurotechnology, if we wait 10 years, we will be wearing headsets that will be, you know, brainwave and training us, or people will be using this before and after job, you know, opportunities, etc. This stuff is really coming quite fast. If we don't set the norms now for genetic engineering in a positive and proactive and community-driven fashion, that window's closed in another 5 years. They've already had the first symposium. There's on this. There's a primate facility in China with 100,000 primates that are undergoing different forms of genetic testing and other experimentation. So the world we live in today is a world where we have a window for setting up new norms and new rules. The question is, how do we take that power and do that proactively together, rather than being the takers of whatever rules end up out of the complex system of negotiation between weakened governments with fiscal challenges and increasingly powerful technology companies who are, I would think, have the best of intentions, but may have the incentives sometimes not quite in the right areas of alignment. So I just want to say thanks to the fourth group, Alvin, thanks to the London Shapers Hub and everyone else who's pushing us to think on these issues. And thanks to all of you for being part of this conversation.
It's great to see you, and thanks for giving us food for how, as the fourth group, we can really respond to the fourth industrial revolution. So thanks, Nick. We'll now actually be breaking up into groups, but of course, during this time, you can feel free to take some refreshments. Clearly, there's a lot of things to think about, and so it'd be good for us to have some time to discuss as groups. So I'm going to ask Hannah Pully-Williams, Cillian and Sarah Webster to take some groups. Please try and mingle around them, and you've got space here, in that room and downstairs. And I guess the three things that would be really good to know are personal reflections, what you think of this whole thing for you, but also for London and society and the global context. What it means for politics, particularly, and practically, what does this mean for Londoners? So, as we have said already, a lot of people here are as part of the London Global Shapers, so it'd be good to think about our local context. So, personal reflections, politics, and London. Make sense? Cool. All right, great.
So we're just gonna turn off the broadcast, but just one last round of applause. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys. See you next time.
Bye.
Yeah.